Welcome, everybody. I have only 20 minutes, so I'm going to go through the slides pretty quickly. So I apologize in advance for talking too fast and probably making too many mistakes. The title of my dissertation is Psychological Capital, an Internal Resource for Counseling Students Coping with Academic and Clinical Stress. So we know that counseling students, they're dealing with two kinds of stress, not only academic, but also clinical. And those stressors are affecting their mental health. And you know, their mental health is very important because it's not only their mental health, but also it can positively or negatively affect their effectiveness when they're working with clients. And they're ethically required to monitor their mental health. Stress can cause a whole bunch of, a variety of problems: depression, anxiety, decreased job satisfaction, low self-esteem. And basically, it can affect negatively counselors' effectiveness by limiting their attention, by lowering their working alliance and supervisory working alliance. So what are the stressors? Counseling students are dealing with increased coursework. So K-CRAB requirements has been increasing over the course of these recent years. Also, they're dealing with clinical stressors, working with clients, supervisory relationship, finding an internship or practicum site, which is a headache, and basically the conflict between their role as an intern or practicum student and their other roles in their lives. Evaluation also is a stressful process for all students, and counseling students in particular are not only being evaluated based on their knowledge, but also they're being evaluated based on their counseling skills. What is the current approach to address this problem? So we know that counseling students are dealing with stress. What we do, we talk about self-care. So unilaterally, we introduce the concept and notion of self-care to our counseling students. Do self-care. And basically, self-care has been defined as self-initiated behaviors that promote good health and well-being. So it could be physical exercise, it could be spiritual activities, it could be receiving social support, especially from people whom we love, who are important to us. Receiving counseling services, individual counseling, group counseling. So basically, these are some self-care strategies that we introduce our counseling students to. What is the problem with this approach? It's very good, and it has been effective to some extent, but it lacks one thing. It's very unilateral. So we don't really consider individual differences when we are introducing people to self-care. We unilaterally and uniformly introduce all of them to self-care, do self-care, but it doesn't recognize the individual differences as to how they cope and perceive stress. So let me introduce the construct of PsyCap, or psychological capital. This construct is rooted in the premise of positive psychology. And basically, it's defined as your level of efficacy, optimism, hope, and resiliency. So efficacy, or self-efficacy, or confidence, basically your belief about how good you are at doing something. This is self-efficacy. Optimism, making a positive attribution about succeeding now and in the future. Hope, persevering towards a goal and redirecting if needed to achieve that goal. And resiliency, not giving up in the face of failure. So positive psych is all those four things all together. And in fact, it does recognize the individual differences because it has been defined based on individual differences. And research has highlighted the role of PsyCap in academic and helping profession as well. Research has shown that psychological capital is negatively correlated with emotional labor, burnout, occupational stress, work-family conflicts, and compassion fatigue. It also positively correlated with levels of well-being, academic performance, coping mechanisms, students' learning and their adjustment to stress, and finally, their mental health. So what I did, I got a sample of 216 counseling students, and then I measured their clinical stress, academic stress, mental health, and their level of PsyCap. And basically, I studied the relationship between these four constructs. It was a cross-sectional study. So these are the instruments that I used. And also, at the very end, I used an open-ended question, and I asked them to identify their main life stressors, in addition to the four constructs. So these are some descriptive stats, the result that I got. As you can see, the majority of participants are white. In terms of program specialty, as you can see, the majority of participants are coming from clinical mental health counseling and school counseling. I got some folks from other programs as well. So again, most of them are coming from traditional face-to-face counseling programs, and most of them are full-time students. So 64% of them reported having sufficient knowledge about self-care. 33% of them reporting having some knowledge about self-care, and only less than 1% reported having limited knowledge about self-care. Most of them were engaged in self-care practices, and only 13 participants, 6%, reported no engagement in self-care practices. These are the numbers, descriptive stats for self-care practices that they're involved. And this list is actually practices that they identified, themselves, that they're engaged in. Self-reflection, eating healthy, supervision, alcohol, and attending AA meetings at the very last. So I got something interesting. 77% of participants reported moderately or very stressed, okay? On one hand, I see this. On the other hand, 93% of them reported engagement in self-care, and 99% of them reported that they have at least some level of knowledge about self-care. So although they're engaged in self-care and they know self-care, still the stress level is pretty high. And one explanation could be what I just mentioned about the current approaches, the problem with the current approaches. I also asked them to identify their main life stressors. As you can see, the first one is school-related work. The second one is clinical stressors related to internship and their practicum and financial difficulties. There were other stressors as well, as you can see. Medical condition, poor time management, election, event, children. And these are the mean scores and standard deviations for the instruments that I used. And basically, I had this research question. My research question was, what are the relationships between these four constructs that I measure? Academic stress, clinical stress, psychological capital, or PsyCap, and their mental health. And I was wondering if there would be any difference between the subgroups within my sample. So hypothesis 1, 2, and 3, basically, hypothesis 1, the construct that I measured are correlated significantly. And number 2, counseling students with higher levels of PsyCap will report experiencing lower clinical and academic stress. And also, counseling students at higher levels of PsyCap will report having higher levels of mental health. This is the result. As you can see, I got 3 high correlations. All of the correlations are significant. I got 3 strong correlations, 2 moderate, and 1 small. And basically my 3 first hypotheses were supported. Hypothesis 4 is a little bit tricky. I hypothesized that students who were working with clients are experiencing higher levels of clinical stress, okay? Because I got 2 groups, students who were working with clients and students who had not started. The results showed the exact opposite. So students who were not working with clients reported having higher levels of clinical stress. And one possible explanation for that would be because I asked them to project their thoughts and feeling, thinking about their future clinical experience, and because they had not started seeing clients, they overestimated their clinical stress. On the other hand, when I compared these 2 groups, students who are working with clients, their overall stress and their academic stress were higher. So you may ask, why academic stress? So Although clinical stress and academic stress are two separated constructs, for counseling students, they're kind of interrelated. So they're dealing with clinical stressors. At the same time, they're taking this internship and practicum course, and they need to show their case. They need to be evaluated. So for counseling students in particular, clinical and academic stressors are interrelated, and there is some overlap. So when they're reporting their academic stress, it's possible that they're also reporting some aspect of their clinical stress. That might be a good explanation for this. And I'm going to refer to this explanation furthermore. So hypothesis 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Basically, I assumed that there is no significant difference in terms of gender, program specialty, race and ethnicity, and delivery methods. And again, there is no significant difference between full-time and part-time students in their level of PsyCap, academic stress, clinical stress, and mental health. And results supported that. So these are just numbers. I'm not going to take much time on that. But basically, results showed that there was no significant difference in terms of race, ethnicity, as you can see, in terms of method of delivery, face-to-face, online, hybrid, and between full-time and part-time students. I conducted a regression analysis. So dependent variable, mental health. Independent variable, clinical stress, academic stress, and PsyCap. Psychological capital, or PsyCap, and clinical and academic stress, they were both significant predictors for mental health. Clinical stress, on the other hand, was not a significant predictor. And again, I'm going to refer to that measurement issue that we had. So academic stress not only captures academic stress, but also captures part of the clinical stress. So the regression weight for clinical stress was not significant. So as you can see, PsyCap is affecting mental health. And that's the total effect of PsyCap on mental health. So after doing the mediation analysis, what I found was that the effect of PsyCap is partially mediated by academic stress. And for those who have not taken research methods yet, it means that in addition to its direct effect on mental health, PsyCap also affects mental health through academic stress by influencing individuals' perception about stress. Am I making sense? Hopefully. So mediation model basically shows that PsyCap is an internal resource that can empower individuals to cope with stress. It could be through fostering confidence, it could be through positive appraisal, it could be through positive reframing, and also positive self-talk. Implications for counselor education. So if we just introduce this concept to our students, they can understand better and they can make sense of their strengths and vulnerabilities in coping with stress better. Also, we can integrate some activities that potentially can help our students to develop and improve their PsyCap. Implications for counseling practice. There are clients who are dealing with anxiety, stress, and lack of confidence, lack of willpower. If you could just introduce this concept to them, they can understand what they're struggling with. And also, if we can improve their PsyCap, that would be very beneficial for them. Also, not only for clients, for ourselves, we're dealing with a lot of stress as practitioners. And we can utilize PsyCap and PsyCap improvement for our mental health and our burnout preventions. And implications for future research. My study was not an experimental study, so I cannot really talk about causation in a very firm way. It was a cross-sectional analysis. So an experimental study would be really helpful. Also, I was thinking about developing a new instrument, particularly for counseling students, because their clinical and academic stress are very interrelated. And also, a qualitative exploration could be really helpful, kind of looking at the relationships between these four constructs from a qualitative lens. Limitations, it's a cross-sectional analysis. I just mentioned that. The sampling was convenience sampling, recruitment was voluntary, and the results only limited to KCRAP programs. We talked about the measurement issue that we faced, and also self-report has its own limitations. How much time do I have? Okay. So the model that I presented is a significant model, and its effect size is meaningful, yet it doesn't fit well. And the reason could be because of the model specifications. And I know I'm talking about some things that some people may not really relate to. Model specifications means that when you're presenting a model, you need to include all the variables. I only included stress. So PsyCap can affect mental health through other adversities as well, like failure, like loss or grief. So that was another limitation for this study. And basically, this finding shows that PsyCap not only affects students' mental health directly, but also it affects their mental health by influencing their academic stress. And the bottom line is that as counseling students, you need to feel more hopeful, optimistic, resilient, and confident so that you have a better mental health. Thank you.
Ready?
No.
Okay. Ready now?
Yes.
So first of all, how's your PsyCap today?
It's great.
It's great.
Yeah.
Good. Good. All right. So I want to start off asking you a descriptive question.
Mm-hmm.
So you measured your folks on a couple of these different scales. You were hoping that those scales would reference things like their stress, their mental health, their PsyCap. How stressed were they? How healthy were they mentally? What did their PsyCap look like?
So I knew you would ask this question. Their level of PsyCap and their level of clinical stress was not significantly different from the norm, from the norm of those instruments that I used. Academic stress, I used the new version of that instrument. And it's interesting, the article has not been published yet, so I don't have the mean and standard deviation for that. And then I reached out to the author a while ago. Fortunately, I have not heard anything back. The author actually was the one who gave me the new instrument, encouraging me to use the new instrument, but I didn't have the means and standard deviation for that, so I need to do follow-up on that.
Mm-hmm. So we don't know about that one, but on the others, they look kind of like other folks that have been studied before. So they're not exceedingly high or low relative to other groups.
Well, in terms of the instrument that I used, the result was not significantly different. But like other descriptives, for example, their level of stress, when they say that more than 30% of them are reporting very stressed, it means that they're dealing with significant amount of stress at the same time.
I want to look at one issue that you were talking about. So you wanted to see this academic stress and the clinical stress.
Yes.
And originally you thought these counseling students, they're going to get really burdened because they have academic stress, because they're students, and then, wow, on top of this, they got to deal with these clients in the clinic.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be really high. But we didn't find that, did we?
Not for clinical stress.
No. And so you think that clinical stress got wrapped into academic stress for these folks.
Exactly, because clinical stress is also part of their academic stress. They're not being trained clinically separated from their academic, requirements.
So I want to ask you a kind of a hypothetical question, or maybe it's the next study question. So let's say that you wanted to actually study whether that's true. How might you come up with the next study that would focus on that academic clinical aspect and seeing whether they are separate or merged?
Like I said, I think the best way probably would be developing a new instrument for counseling students so that we can look at their stress, because like I said, their academic and clinical stress are very intertwined. So developing a new instrument could help us to kind of look at this particularly and in a contextualized way. And also we can consider some subscale in that instrument so that we kind of see if their clinical and academic stressors are, what is the relationship with these two stressors for them.
There are a couple of details that I want to come back to, but I want to ask, what do you think are the benefits of clinical engagement related to your findings?
Clinical engagement? So basically, I think I kind of touched on that. When you introduce PsyCap to your clients, they can understand, they can conceptualize their anxiety, their stress, their lack of confidence, their lack of willpower in a better way, in a more effective way. And then by improving their PsyCap, they can actually get better.
Talking about your clients, and I'm sorry, I didn't make my question clear. What are the benefits of stress for interns who are clinically engaged?
Benefit of stress? So stress level, no stress is not going to be helpful because, as we know, in order for students to grow developmentally, they always need a balance of support and challenge. And we know what support is. At the same time, challenge is the source of stress. So in order for them to grow, they need a balance of both. But also, we need that clinical stressors and academic stressors could go too much to the point where it can cause depression, anxiety, and those mental health conditions. So what I'm arguing, I don't want to eliminate stress completely, because stress is helpful. At the same time, we need to keep that balance.
Your data suggests that those students who are clinically engaged showed less stress.
They overestimate, clinically engaged, so that's the thing. They reported higher levels of academic stress, and they reported higher levels of overall stress. And we talked about why their academic stress is higher, because their clinical stressors were kind of subsumed in their academic stress. And the reason that students who were not working with clients reported higher levels of clinical stress, I talked about it, one of the possible explanations is that because they were not actually working with clients and they had not seen clients, so they had to project and they had to kind of imagine their clinical experience in the future. So they overestimated their clinical experience, because in terms of, when you're talking about, thinking about self-efficacy, one of the factors that actually improves someone's self-efficacy is accomplishment. They had not accomplished working with clients. So no wonder they're very nervous about working with clients.
What would be the role of the academic curriculum for those students who are seeing clients? The academic curriculum specifically to those students who are actively seeing clients? What's happening in the academic curriculum that seems to be built in potentially? That's
a very good point. So not only they're seeing clients, but also they're taking courses related to their clinical engagement, practicum, internship. And they had to present, they had to talk about their clients. They're being evaluated based on their counseling skills. So those are all sources of stress for them.
What else is happening though for those students who are clinically engaged when they're doing practicum and when they're doing internship in particular? What else is in place?
Supervision.
Talk a little bit about the role of supervision in clinical stress.
So yeah, that's a good point. So also research shows that supervisory relationship could be a source of stress because of the conflicts, because of the, just being evaluated. Supervisory relationship is not like a friendship, it's like a evaluative kind of relationship. So that could be also a source of stress for novice counselors because they're being judged and they're being evaluated based on their performance.
Could it also be a source of support?
Also, yeah, definitely, yeah. So that's why basically when I asked them to identify their self-care strategies, some of them actually mentioned getting supervision. So supervision is kind of like a double-edged sword. It can be a source of support, and also it could be a source of challenge and stress.
But that wasn't evaluated in your study necessarily, in terms of the role of supervision in that particular way?
No.
I'm going to dovetail off Tom's question to you. And Abbas, you had 4 instruments. And the PsyCap questionnaire, the mean, yours was 113.9 over a total of 144. Where would you place that in terms of their PsyCap?
Their PsyCap was not, my sample, their PsyCap was not significantly different from the norm population.
Right, so, but just where would that put it, in low, moderate, or high, their PsyCap level, at a 114 over, or 113 over 144?
You mean the mean?
Yeah. Where would you put that? I mean, just roughly, where would you put that? As low PsyCap, moderate HiCap, or high PsyCap?
It's definitely not low, and right now I can't say if it is considered high or moderate.
But it's somewhere in the moderate
Yeah.
high range, okay. And then your academic stress reaction scale, they were, that was measurement of academic stress, and that was, the mean was 53.06 over 136. Where would you put them on that? Low, moderate, high?
It's moderate towards high, but still, because I don't have the mean and standard deviation for that, I can't firmly say that. But
just a guess. I'm just
yeah.
trying to get just what your, and then your clinical stress, your mental health professional scale was 37.9 over 76.
Moderate towards high.
Moderate to high. And then finally, on your their mental health level, that was the mental health continuum, and that was a 49.86 over 70, so almost 50 over 70. Where would you put that?
I think it's moderate towards high.
Okay. So I guess my question about that is, one of your premises for this study is that we need to keep studying this with that, because the problem that you've presented is that we have, and you used the term in your paper at one point, that people are experiencing debilitative stress. And I don't think your findings show that students at least in your sample, in counseling programs are experiencing debilitative stress. It's really moderate levels of stress. And I might say that in an academic program that you would expect to be stressful, that almost would be expected, wouldn't it? How do you respond to that?
First of all, in terms of, because clinical stressors was found not to be a significant predictor. So what I'm emphasizing and highlighting is their academic stress, because it not only captured their academic stress, but also it captured part of their clinical stressors. And right now, I don't have the information to say that if their academic stress level is significantly higher than the norm, because I don't have the mean and standard deviation. We roughly estimated that. I would say that part of my descriptive stats are showing that, their stress level is pretty significant, because right now about 30% of them reported being very stressed. And it was interesting, as I was collecting my data, as we were moving towards the end of the semester, the stress level dropped. So in the first 2 weeks, roughly half of the participants reported feeling very stressed. But moving towards the end of the semester, that percentile dropped. So when half of the participants are saying that they're feeling very stressed, I think that says something about their stress level.
And I think it's the very stress that I'm asking you about. And we've had this conversation before, but prior to earlier stages of your research, we've talked about the fact how stressed is very stressed, and is very stressed, clinically stressed. And I don't mean from clinical work, but clinically stressed from the point of I need help. I need help with that. And what I'm asking you is what makes you at the end of this, when, again, you don't have means and standard deviations, but on on the surface, it looks as though folks are stressed, as you would expect them to be in an academic program. But what is your strongest argument for why this is something that we really ought to, because you've made recommendations that we need to integrate this into counselor education, into the programs, which means putting something aside because there's not room for anything more. So what makes
Well, I didn't say that putting something, I didn't say.
well, that's just the way it is. You know, if you want to integrate something new, then something's got to give.
Well, what I suggested was just like a little bit of inclusion of PsyCap into the current approach. So I'm not saying that we should eliminate the whole notion of self-care. Self-care has been effective, but what we need is a little bit of individualized notion about self-care that we can easily include that in our wellness model or whatever you want to call it. So what I'm saying is just like a supplement to the self-care. And also, when you're looking at like all of the moving parts, part of my descriptive stats is saying that stress is significant for counseling students. And previous research also shows that counseling students, I cannot remember exactly, but a significant percentage of counseling students reported very stressed, and their stress level were 2 standards deviation higher than average individuals. So that's what I got.
So that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's good for now. I'll come back.
So you did some statistics.
Yes, I did.
Always makes me feel good when that happens. All right, so let's talk about the regressions that you did.
Good.
So you were targeting mental health,
Mm-hmm.
and you loaded in your other variables as potential predictors.
Exactly.
What happened?
What happened was clinical stress was found to was not significant, and academic and PsyCap, both of them were significant predictors.
Okay, so clinical stress,
Nope,
not a significant predictor.
not a significant predictor.
But academic stress and PsyCap were
Yes.
significant predictors in your model. Were there any anomalies that happened along the way as you were doing that analysis? Was it clean? Was it without problems, without violations of assumptions? Was it problematic in any ways?
I need a hint. It was very clean. No, I'm kidding. Well, basically, what was shocking was the fact that I was assuming that clinical stressors is something significant, but then it was not. And then the argument that I actually was thinking about was that because academic stress is absorbing all the regression weights associated with clinical stress, that was the reason basically. And by anomaly and things like
Did you start with a regression equation that just had your predictors, clinical stress, academic stress, and PsyCap? Or was there something else in the model at the beginning?
You mean the interactions? Okay. So at the very beginning, I was not sure that the relationship is moderation and mediation. So that's why I also included interactions to see any interaction between the elements. And interactions, they didn't get significant regression weights. So, and there were also like a collinearity between academic stress and an interaction between academic stress and PsyCap. And I'm kind of like following you. You said that when there is collinearity and you have like one clean construct and one interaction, you go with the clean construct. So basically, I got rid of the interaction and I included academic stress.
So you're blaming me?
Yes.
Just so that's clear.
Let's make that very clear.
Just so that's clear. All right, so you try to model this mediation moderation with interactions in the regression, and the regression blows up.
Yes.
There's multiclinearity, and you have to get rid of those.
Yeah.
But later on, you talk about mediation.
Yes.
So what is it? Is it mediated or is it not?
So basically, moderation didn't work because the interactions were not significant. And then when I got rid of the interaction between PsyCap and academic stress, and I just included academic stress and clinical and PsyCap, well, clinical stress was out because it didn't get enough regression weights. It was not significant. So I had academic stress, PsyCap as predictors, and mental health as the criterion or dependent. So the regression model actually worked. It was a solid regression model. But also theoretically, I was trying to make sense of their relationship. So I examined, I tested if a mediation model would be a significant model, and it was significant, and it was meaningful.
But
It doesn't fit. Why?
how do you know it doesn't fit?
It doesn't fit based on structural equation modeling indices and the numbers that you check for. Whenever you want to see if a model does fit, there are some indices and there are some numbers that needs to fall in a certain range. So the model didn't fit, and the reason I very briefly touched on that, it could be because a lack of specification model. So I only studied PsyCap. So here is PsyCap, here is mental health. So PsyCap is directly affecting mental health. It also indirectly affects mental health through academic stress. It's like when people are facing academic stress, PsyCap is getting activated. So there are some other forms of adversities that are different from stress, and PsyCap may get activated once they are present, but I didn't study them. So I think a lack of specification model could be an explanation for my model that doesn't fit.
So there's been some review of the literature related to PsyCap, and a couple of the comments have related to some similar contexts, that it is essentially developed in sort of an inductive way from individual focus to group focus, and that actually most of the work in psychological capital is really focused at the individual level and less about group work. For example, how students might, thinking about our students, how students might work in the context of an organization or a larger structure, a team of people who are evaluating clients and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about its application at the individual level, but also how it then would apply to your findings to counselors, professionals working sort of in a more group setting?
You're right. While PsyCap is being explored and examined within mostly an individual kind of context, but at the same time, I'm thinking about group dynamics. So for example, we have individual counselings for improving, for example, let's say resiliency. So I think when the setting is a group setting, we can even incorporate the group dynamics and benefit from the group dynamics and work more effectively to improve resiliency or PsyCap or whatever. Like basically group dynamics is helping us, is not really changing, or it doesn't create obstacles as far as I'm
thinking about students, for example. We're evaluating each individual student's psychological capital, in addition to some other aspects. And so we're looking at them individually. So I'm wondering, how would we use PsyCap in the context of students who are going to be working in groups when they go off into employment?
Now I understood your question.
Working as a group, for example, in our clinic, where people need to work together to be able to promote the welfare of clients, to keep up with their writing paperwork.
So basically, how can we evaluate and assess group PsyCap?
In other words, it's only, or at this point in time, it seems only to be applied to individuals.
I think that's the good thing about PsyCap, that it's very individualized, because what we were lacking was recognizing the individual differences. So, and PsyCap has been operationalized based on individuals' internal resources. So it talks about everyone's internal resource. So right now I cannot think of like a way to assess a group PsyCap, because it's very individual, and that's the benefit of PsyCap, I would say.
How do we apply that to teaching an internship? How do I apply that to 12 different people who are in the class? That is, how does information about PsyCap change the way in which our courses are taught, our supervision is conducted? Because one-on-one doesn't happen all the time.
Yeah, one of the ways that we can do is that we can measure all of them, and we can deal with the mean and standard deviation. So when we cannot deal with it individually, which is recommended, which is the best case scenario, but it's not possible all the time, and you're right, but we can have an estimation about the group PsyCap by assessing the mean and standard deviation of that group.
So we haven't really, I'm saying the point seems to be that there hasn't been much study related to the group aspect.
You're right. Because I think the nature of PsyCap is very individualized.
Well, it seems that it needs to be more of a sort of progressive and sort of methodological manner in which we look at the science of PsyCap. And so, you know, that's just off the head. I'm looking at your literature.
Okay, sure.
I want to go back to something you said a minute ago. When I asked you about how you saw this being used, you said you didn't see it as a major change, just sort of a supplement to what we do. How important do you see your findings in your study as being? It almost sounded to me like you said, well, this is just sort of the cherry on the top. Is that what you've worked 2 years to prove, or how important are these findings to you?
How important it is based on the descriptive stats, like I said, it's interesting. 99% of the participants reported being engaged in self-care. 93% of participants reported having at least some knowledge of self-care. Great, but still, at some point, half of the participants, and at the end of the study, 30% of the participants reported feeling very stressed. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily the cherry on the top, because although they're having this knowledge and engagement in self-care, still the stress level is pretty high. And what I suggested was not eliminating the whole self-care, because it's very effective and helpful. At the same time, if they help our students to understand why they're feeling anxious, why they're feeling, that they're not confident or competent, and actually improving their optimism and resiliency and self-efficacy and hope, that can help them. That can be a very good supplement to the current approaches of self-care.
So there I was getting on you for underselling yourself. Now I want to point out a place where I think you oversold yourself.
Okay,
You wrote
very
on
cool.
page 107, you don't need to look at it, I'm just going to read it for you, but it says, given the direct effects of PsyCap on individuals' mental health and the mitigating role it plays in the relationship with stressors, clients who are struggling with anxiety, poor self-efficacy, or lack of motivation, willpower, or confidence in therapeutic change may benefit, and then you go talk about from PsyCap.
Mm-hmm.
I see your study didn't show anything about that, about clients.
Well, that was the implication. That was the future possible. Like my sample were all counseling students.
Do you think that your sample represents clients?
Well, I cannot. Well, my samples were human beings and counseling students, and there was a significant relationship between their PsyCap and their mental health. So, and my study proved that. So.
But your study also was really based on their academic and clinical stress.
Yes.
Academic in particular.
Yes, and also other studies has shown the relationship between PsyCap and mental health. And what I'm saying is, theoretically and based on the previous research and what I have found, although I looked at the academic stress, but other previous research, if I'm not mistaken, previous research actually studied the relationship between work stressors and PsyCap and mental health. So we know this relationship between PsyCap, academic stress, clinical stress, work stress. So I'm not saying that all of the stressors are the same, but at the same time, it's very promising that we can use PsyCap for clients. Well, of course, future research is needed, but it's promising.
that's one area I'd like you to clarify a little bit in your paper.
Okay.
I'll make a note of that. Just that, I think that it's promising is better than saying this the way it's said here.
It is promising.
Look like you're pending, Tom.
I am.
You're done?
No. I've just begun.
Okay.
PsyCap versus resilience.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference?
PsyCap, one of the components of PsyCap is resilience. So PsyCap is more comprehensive. So resilience, when you're talking about resilience, what is resilience? Resilience is when you're facing difficulties, when you're facing adversities, when you're facing failure, you don't give up and you get back on again and you persevere and you don't lose, you don't discourage, you kind of have this thick skin. That's resilience. But PsyCap, one of the components of PsyCap is resilience. PsyCap also talks about optimism, also talks about confidence and hope. So it's more comprehensive.
Okay, so PsyCap's bigger than resilience.
Yes.
So resilience is stick-to-itness.
Resilience is not giving up when facing adversities. That's resilience.
Doesn't resilience have also to do with adapting?
It could.
Positive adaptations?
It could.
Changing your
It could.
strategies?
It could, yeah.
Doesn't PsyCap include that?
Well, PsyCap includes whatever resilience includes, because it includes resiliency. So
So tell me how we would see the difference between resilience and PsyCap.
So resilience, the difference between PsyCap and resilience is that resilience is not giving up in the face of adversities, when you're facing adversities. PsyCap includes the whole resiliency. Also, PsyCap includes optimism and confidence and hope. So it covers more area than resiliency itself.
Which of those aspects do you think is related to mental health?
All of them.
All, so hope is related. If you're not hopeful, you're not mentally healthy.
That's a very interesting question. When I'm thinking about elements of PsyCap, I think this is very anecdotal, like theoretically I'm talking. I don't have any evidence on my study, but basically some elements of PsyCap is directly affecting your mental health, just constantly. When you're optimistic, you're happier. When you're having hope, you're happier. You have higher and better mental health. Some other aspects of PsyCap, for example, resiliency, I think they're dormant. And they get activated in the face of adversities. So when you're resilient and you're sitting here, there is no really a significant difference between someone who is not and who is resilient, because there's no adversities. But in the face of adversities, you can see that people react differently. So that's where, for example, resiliency, and I think that's why we needed other adversities to complete our model, because PsyCap is directly and constantly affecting mental health, some element of PsyCap, and some element of other elements of PsyCap needs some other elements to get activated and come into play.
So what was activating your sample?
You mean
What was the
their
adversity?
The adversity was academic and clinical stressors.
So if we look at those stressors, and we see high levels of stress, we would think that PsyCap would be activated.
Well, actually, my model is saying that. My model is saying that not only PsyCap is affecting mental health directly, but its effects is being mediated partially through academic stress. So basically, because having higher levels of PsyCap is influencing your perception about stress, that's the indirect way of influence of PsyCap on your mental health.
So what would you expect the correlation to be based on your activation theory between stress and PsyCap?
The correlation is a significant and also negative correlation.
I said based on your activation theory, not based on what you found.
Okay. So
Gets his coat on straight here. I'm going to answer this question.
now here is the thing. So this, I think we already talked about it this in your office, but I'm going to repeat what I said there, and you were kind of like happy with what I said. So please be happy
Blame it
again.
on me
Be happy again. So the actual stressors, the actual source of stress, it's something there, and we are not able to measure it. Okay. All we can measure is participants' perception about stress. Okay. And what we are saying is that the source of stress is out there. We're not able to measure that. We measure our participants' perceived stress. And then the higher levels of PsyCap, the lower levels of perceived stress. That's the argument. So yeah, I talked about how PsyCap, some elements of PsyCap gets activated when there are some adversities. But basically, it doesn't mean that, higher adversities, higher PsyCap. It doesn't mean that because, first of all, we don't measure the actual source of stress out there. We only measure people's reaction to stress, they perceived stress, if that makes sense. Please be happy.
So there's some indication, it looks like, that two elements, two findings suggest that they emerge as really important contexts in detecting coping mechanisms. And it sounds as if some ways what you're describing is psychological capital as a larger frame of reference for helping students cope with the stress of being in a master's program in counseling. And so there's some research that suggests that actually personality factors are as important as psychological capital for coping mechanisms. So maybe we should just be teaching people coping mechanisms.
Well,
assisting people in coping mechanisms.
Yeah, I mentioned that research has shown that people are not the same as to how they perceive and cope with stress. And that's why I mentioned, for example, research has shown that coping mechanism in terms of, attitude of gratitude, in terms of their level of ego development, your area of expertise, and other, basically their personality, research has shown that, those differences, those factors can influence the way that people are reacting, individuals, react to stress. So, and I introduced PsyCap as something that actually captures those individual differences. So yeah, I could have used personality traits, characteristics. I could have used only coping mechanisms, but I used PsyCap.
We could just, it says personality factors and positive psychological capital has emerged as important constructs for detecting coping mechanisms. So should we just be looking for these particular personality factors? High extroversion, openness, conscientiousness?
The reason that I use PsyCap...
Get them on the front end, rather than...
Big five.
You're right. The reason that I use PsyCap is that PsyCap is directly dealing with stress and adversities. So, for example, Big Five, they're not directly related to, okay, when you're dealing with some sort of adversities, what would you do? They don't deal with it. Yeah, there are correlations, but PsyCap specifically has been defined as internal resources that you can use for your coping. That's why I use PsyCap.
And you're saying because we can teach that.
We can improve that, and I would say...
So it's not a personality construct.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's you can develop that. You can learn that. You can improve that. Exactly.
It's developmental. You're saying it's a skill we can increase. It's not a psychological developmental shift. In other words, people who are higher on PsyCap are going to be more complex thinkers?
I wouldn't necessarily say so.
Because-
Yeah, I would say that it's not like IQ, which is something fixed, and it's not. I wouldn't say it's really like cognitive development kind of thing. I don't think that it. Well, as far as I know, I'm just talking off the top of my head. I don't think that it has something to do with complexity, complex thinking, but it's something. Like the authors, they say that it's state-like. It's not. It's something that can be developed. And that's why we can capitalize on that, because we can improve that.
What is the data that tells us that it can be developed?
There are some research, experimental research, that actually they use some micro-interventions, not for counseling students, but it showed that their level of PsyCap increased.
Your skill.
Their level of, basically it was a self-report kind of thing, but basically their optimism, resiliency, confidence, and hope were increased after the interventions.
Mm-hmm. We don't know how long it persisted.
That's one of the implications. That's one of the things that I mentioned in my dissertation. That's a good point, because they were all micro-interventions, mm-hmm. and we don't really know. We know that continuity is a factor, but future research needs to further examine that.
So the notion that it develops, or the finding or the suggestion that it is skill development, means that our developmental context isn't relevant. But that's not, that's counter to what some of the research is saying.
Say that again. I'm
No,
not
we can
sure.
teach skills, but
Yeah.
that's not the same thing as teaching, as promoting complexity. So,
I think there are some differences. I'm having a hard time comparing these two, because at the same time we're talking about improvement and development.
mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I think the nature of them are a little bit different.
Okay.
So
In other words, we don't know, there's not much out there that suggests that
The relation.
psychological capacity, that PsyCap is related to conceptual complexity.
no, as far as I know.
You might go back to a long time ago in a land far, far away, that Gil Noam's research suggested that those of us who are at higher developmental, more complex developmental levels actually may be more subject to psychological disruption. And so, that's something to keep in mind, is that, how is that relative to psychological capital, and what we might be employing with students who are all pretty complex thinkers. I'm looking out here, and they're looking sort of complex right now.
One or two.
Yeah, one or two, I'm not sure which ones, I'm not, so. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, ideally, I would say that overall, those students who are coming into our program are fairly psychologically complex, which makes them slightly more at risk, according to the data, for, some psychological challenges. So where does psychological capital come into that?
Well, psychological capital, I would say that it's your internal resource when you're dealing with adversities. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, cognitive development and complex thinking is, I think the nature of it is very different, and like they say that you know more, you suffer more. So of course, when you're thinking in a more complex way, you understand the nuances, and you may be more vulnerable to the things that may affect your mental health. That part makes sense. As far as the relationship between PsyCap and cognitive development, I don't know. I have not found any research on that.
I'm thinking more about a matching model than a boss. So we have, particularly bright, complex thinkers wandering into our programs that we recruit to come into our courses. So how do we then assist them in developing psychological capital?
How do we do that?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that sounds like we're hoping people have it rather than developing it. I guess that's what I'm asking.
So you're asking about how we can improve PsyCap?
Develop
PsyCap, yeah, develop or improve. So there are some interventions that have been introduced by research that we can use them, but still, as far as I know, there's no research on PsyCap development for counseling students, or the continuity and how long they last. We have no information on that, so that's pretty new. So that's why future research should look into that.
back to that. Go ahead.
You wrote this, and I found it interesting about it. So you write that you said all those spiritual activities, receiving support from family and friends, mindfulness-related activities, and it goes on those. It says that what you said in your research, what you were surprised about is that only one participant directly identified positive thinking as self-care practice. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, the reason that I mentioned that was because, like, when you're thinking about the elements of PsyCap, one of the elements was optimism. And when I was looking at the self-care strategies that my participants were using, none of them really addressed any elements of PsyCap. And the only that was close was positive thinking. So I kind of...
Wouldn't mindfulness sort of be there?
Well, mindfulness, when you're thinking about mindfulness is about awareness of the thoughts and feelings. It doesn't really capture PsyCap. So what I was trying to say was that students are not really familiar with the internal resources, at least with the PsyCap elements that they have and they can capitalize on. They're not really familiar with it, or like they didn't mention it, they didn't identify it. The only one that was kind of close was positive thinking. That was it.
Well, that wasn't really my question. The question that I have is if you weren't using a measure of the mental health continuum, short form, to determine someone's mental health, what kind of observable things would you see in a person that was not mentally healthy? Observable things. What kind of things happen to people who are experiencing mental disability?
Lack of mental health.
Okay, well, what does that mean?
Like lower scores.
Okay, lower scores, but not scores. How about behaviors? What kind of behaviors do you see in people who are struggling mentally?
Well, symptoms of depression, anxiety, lack of productivity, lack of empathy. There are a whole bunch of symptoms. I'm not sure
Those
if
are good. Those are good. Are we seeing more of those in counseling students than other people?
When you say other people, you mean like other?
Than the normal people out there? Are counseling students testing to be, because they have academic and clinical stressors, are counseling students generally less mentally healthy than the normal population?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're definitely not as healthy as other folks and other students. But I have, again, it's getting really anecdotal, but I have seen a lot of anxiety symptoms among counseling students.
Well, let me speak to that, because I think the concern that I have is that we continue to present stress as the culprit. It's the culprit here, when actually, when is stress our friend? You know, I guess one of my questions to you is, what level of stress would we expect? I mean, interestingly, if I were to do your mental health short form and get really low scores on all the graduate students, I'd wonder, are we really pressing hard enough? Are we really stretching people to the degree that they need to be stretched? So I guess part of me says we might expect that, and we might want that there to be higher stress levels in a program that's intended to stretch people mentally and emotionally and psychologically.
That's a good point. I think I already touched on this question. We need a balance of support and challenge. We need a balance of support and stress. And, stress is, a way of, creating stress for students is a way of challenging them. When we're evaluating them, we are creating some stress for them, but it's not for making them miserable. It's for their growth. And that's why we're challenging them. So the balance is very important. And what research shows that sometimes counseling students in particular, the stress level that they're feeling is too much. Is not, there was a quote in Parker, I don't know if, that says that the stress level that counseling students are dealing with when they're in practicum or internship, it's not an intentional stress because it's not even consistent across different programs.
I think it would be really interesting, but your mental health short form doesn't really, and I'll use the word again, clinical, not meaning clinical stress in the way you used it, but when I think of clinical, I mean clinical meaning I need to get therapeutic help for it, that your measure didn't really just differentiate high stress levels and clinical mental health levels. And I really think an interesting addition or future direction would be to, that measurement to see, are we, when people are in a clinical range, when it is debilitating stress as opposed, because the way, what we have right here is, it's hard for me to distinguish what is good stress and what is expected stress versus what is clinical or
That's a good point, yeah.
The second point that I wanted to make is there's a pretty strong study that, I think I mentioned it briefly before, that associates significant associations with agreeableness and extroversion with overall psych-app. And that was in medical students. So should we be evaluating everybody for agreeableness? I kind of like that idea. Agreeableness and extroversion when we do interviews, when we're admitting students. Everybody pretty agreeable? It's a pretty good study. I'm just asking what you think.
Well,
I mean, you're pretty agreeable and you're pretty extroverted.
yeah,
I'm not sure that agreeable.
yeah, I'm awesome, I know.
Somebody else there could ask.
That could be a way to go about it. I wouldn't disagree.
Okay.
Being agreeable, he wouldn't do it.
How can
Well,
we
it doesn't say
disagree?
agreeable. Well, it says, it says predictors, but it's interesting. But, I mean, I guess do you feel, you've really studied this, and so would it be beneficial in terms of choosing to the best of our ability students, particularly at the doctoral level? We're not going to give the master students who apply, all these tests and so forth, but the master students and the doctoral students who are applying, I mean, should we consider their capacity for where they would be in psychological
I thought about it.
capital? Should we look at extroversion?
Well, particularly about PsyCap, or even, let me talk about PsyCap first, and then I'm going to talk about personality. I thought about including it as one of the implications, but then I was like, okay, when people want to be admitted to a counseling program, and all of these are self-report kind of thing, so of course they're going to have higher levels of PsyCap for sure. So the self-report thing and trying to get admitted to a program, I don't think that we can really trust that. That was the thing. But thinking about personality, I think because the direction is not really obvious and clear, we might potentially be able to use it. Why not?
Well, I think the notion seems to be that the examination of sort of the big five and personality dimension and psych-app capacities, psychological, seems to be relevant in terms of these stressful professional roles. So on the front end, what do? There's not a lot of discussion in the literature about promoting psych-app. And
yeah, it's very limited. It's very limited.
So we don't know if it's possible. If we're talking about big five, that's a done deal, but we're not really looking at what we can do to that big five after they come in,
Sure.
So.
At the same time, big five personality, they're not really, you cannot really improve them because they're kind of fixed, as far as I know. But PsyCap is something that you can develop. That's the bright side for PsyCap.
You used a scale to get at their academic stress and their clinical stress. You used two scales.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You also asked a question, a simple one.
Yeah.
Just said, how stressed are you?
Mm-hmm.
How do those measures relate to each other?
I did not study the correlation, the relationship between these two. So I'm going to look into that. I'm going to test that. But it was not included in my hypotheses. So although I compared the two groups of people who are seeing clients and people who are not seeing clients in terms of their overall stress and other elements, but I didn't test the relationship between overall stress and academic and clinical stress. I didn't do that. Why didn't I do that?
I don't know.
Yeah, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to look into that.
To do that, right? Yeah. So when we started into this, you were pretty adamant
Not going to.
and animated
Uh-huh.
in a discussion that I remember about these poor master students. He was looking out for y'all. They're so stressed. They're going to crack. They're going to break because we've got this clinical and this academic, and it's just taking them to new levels.
You want to ask them?
Yeah.
We have some counseling
Yeah,
students here.
some master's folks in here. So, do you still think that it's
Well, I think based on my results, again, when 1/3 of them are reporting feeling very stressed, I think it justifies looking into that, and it justifies that we think about, different strategies that we can basically implement to support them.
So some people are really stressed.
Mhm.
Do you think that those people in master's level counseling programs are stressed more than people in other master's programs, do you think?
That's a very good question. I think that's kind of like related to what Dr. McAdams said. For example, in terms of their mental health, kind of differentiating like the clinical mental health, clinical conditions when they're disturbed and when they're just stressed would be a good future research. Also, comparing mental health, comparing different programs in terms of their mental health, again, would be a good future research to look into that. As far as I know, I can only say that the results of my study and previous research shows that the stress level that counseling students are going through is significant and is worth studying. But in terms of comparison, I cannot really firmly state anything.
One point that I made, just a note that I had of that, was that I wonder if you might, instead of finding differences between different types of programs, CACREP gives lots of latitude. I mean, they have the standards, but you can meet them in many different ways. I sometimes think maybe you would find more differences in individual programs, the way that it's done, the way that things are done.
You mean?
Like this program and
Versus
Radford
another
and VCU.
CACREP programs?
CACREP programs, because there's a lot of difference between the two, and I just wonder if you might find, if it has to do less with the CACREP standards, the stressors built into those are somewhat similar, where the stressors come in, or how do you evaluate those stressors? Just do you do it through oral exams or by take-home exams, that type of thing. Just an interesting thought as you look at that. But, okay, now, did you have something else on yours? Okay, I want to look at another overstep that I think is one, all right? And I think you wrote on page 98, the findings indicate race ethnicity does not appear to contribute to individuals' level of perceived stress in PsyCap, suggesting that the implications of this study would be applicable to any individual regardless of their race ethnicity. I think that's really fair to say, given that 75% of your applicants were Caucasian.
Well, you're right. Although the results didn't show a significant difference between, for example, Caucasians and other groups in terms of race and ethnicity. But yeah, my sample was predominantly white. And although the actual population is also predominantly white, but I think the racial proportion of my sample is different than population. The result of chi-square showed that. So I actually got more white than the actual population, although the actual population itself is predominantly white. So how would you modify that statement?
I think that's what he's asking you.
Yeah, that's really the question. Yeah.
So you said that it's an overstatement.
I think it's an overstatement. My question to you is, do you really think, given your sample, that you can really say that? Does that really generalize to the population out there?
Theoretically, first of all, the results showed that there was no significant difference. And also, theoretically, when you're thinking about elements of PsyCap, it has nothing to do with race and ethnicity. So there's no research that shows a correlation between PsyCap and race and ethnicity. So as far as we know, so far, no research shows a meaningful relationship between race and ethnicity and PsyCap. So I would say that we can apply the implications of this study to any race and ethnicities.
So let me ask you a follow-up on that, because I think it's important. Is your sample size big enough
To do what?
to support that claim?
I don't think so. I got 216 participants.
Okay.
And, well, the whole sample size is, I think, is big enough for example, for doing some analysis. But because it was predominantly white, the non-white portions are not big enough to support that statement.
Oh,
You liked it, right?
I like the answer, yeah. But I think it supports
Yeah.
his claim. So, so for example, you have 3 American Indian or Alaska Natives. So are you willing to say that those people represent?
No, I wouldn't say that because it's just too few. What I would say though is that, so statistically, I got no difference. Also, when you look at the research, research doesn't show any correlation between race and ethnicity and PsyCap. And when you couple these two, again, that is an overstatement. I think I agree with you, but I don't know how would I soften that because research shows no relationship between race and ethnicity and PsyCap, and also I got no significance. So how should I, kind of like talk about the implications?
We can look at that, but I think by toning that down a little bit, despite limitations in the sample and, that
Oh,
instead
okay.
of saying the implications would be applicable or they
Sure.
supports.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you gotta come back to your,
Something like
gotta come back to
super
your, right.
You're
You gotta come
right.
back to your cautions.
Yeah, yeah.
Because, looking at these data, you have the Asian group, for example, is more than 2 points higher on that factor than the Caucasian white group, but there's only 8
Exactly.
representatives.
Too few.
So-
Yeah. Yeah, too few. You're right.
Boss, what would you note on, somewhere, I don't know what page we're on, that the literature lacks experimental studies investigating the impact of PsyCap on participants' mental health.
Mm-hmm.
So, assuming you pass today and assuming you got a job and have money and all that sort of stuff, or somebody gives you money, what would a
Sounds
study like that look like? An
Well,
experimental study, how would you put that together?
you mean in Canada?
Yes, in Canada,
Okay. So,
in northwestern Canada,
okay.
hip deep in snow.
So I would recruit. I think first we need to look at the interventions that are out there already, and then we need to kind of twist them and modify them based on counseling students, based on the context of counseling programs. And then, it's going to be an experimental study. We recruit students from counseling programs.
But
And
what would be the intervention? Describe to me what the intervention would look like. Keeping in mind, maybe I shouldn't do this for you, keeping in mind, there's so much already going on in a program. So what more can we add that wouldn't even be more burdensome, that would actually be potentially beneficial? So what would this intervention look like? We've got a year long, students wander in. Would you want to start when they first get here? Do you
well,
want
it
to
could
wait
be-
until they take practicum?
well,
Talk a little bit about that.
that's a very good question. I have not thought about it. I have not thought about the details, but I don't know. I would say even once a month, having students for 1 hour and first introducing them to the notion and the construct of PsyCap, and then making them more aware of their PsyCap. And also, there are some activities that actually improve their optimism, improve their efficacy. Doing those activities like a workshop kind of thing. I'm not talking about the very time-consuming kind of interventions. I'm talking about once a month kind of thing, to just make them more aware of, their PsyCap.
Do you think it needs to be, I guess I'm asking you, is an intervention important? Should we just hope that, that PsyCap occurs, that it increases? Would it want to be one-on-one?
Well-
Or should it be a group activity? I want you to begin to think about this, because otherwise, your data's, very interesting, but who cares if there's nothing we can do about it?
well, data shows that PsyCap is something that you can develop. And that's the thing that actually makes me hopeful about it. In terms of the interventions, one-on-one or like as a group thing, like I said, I have not thought about it in details, but I think, as far as I know, there are interventions that you can teach folks individually or in group settings.
You could teach them.
Like, for example, there are activities for kind of like making them more hopeful, or there are activities for making them more optimistic. Positive interventions. It's rooted in the premise of positive psychology. There are interventions to kind of increase their mental health, and we can include PsyCap.
Would those programs, do you think, need to be required in a program? Do you think students would be likely to volunteer in if you weren't giving them food or money?
Well, that's an interesting question. That's a good question. I don't know. Some people, they may not really need to improve their PsyCap because they already have a good level of PsyCap. But some people are struggling. Like, for example, when you're thinking about counseling services, not everyone is going to receive counseling services, but some people, they seek counseling services. So I think at least we can create this as a resource for students who need that.
One more question for me. One recommendation for future research that you made in this study was you recommended a follow-up study that looked at both CACREP accredited and non-CACREP accredited. What's the point in that?
Well,
what are you looking for? I mean, why?
Because we know that CACREP and non-CACREP programs are different. So, and I would like to assume that CACREP programs are more consistent in terms of their requirements, and also in terms of the source of the stressors, the training stressors.
Would you expect them to be more stressful or less stressful?
Non-CACREP?
CACREP.
More stressful because it's more solid and it's more demanding, I would say. It's more rigor. There's more rigor. It's more rigorous. So, but at the same time, when I'm thinking about CACREP is, the stress is meant to be intentional for the most part. Non-CACREP, I have no idea. So that's why I was kind of curious to look into that.
So you'd be doing that to benefit either CACREP or non-CACREP programs. That's why you would want to do that. I mean, that doesn't really say a whole lot about PsyCap. It just simply says...
It's doing the same research but with a different population. Basically, it's what it is.
I'm good.
Just one more question. You noticed that your sample was predominantly dominant culture students. Would you recommend some different frame of reference, different way of looking at your findings if your sample was much more diverse, that is, race and ethnicity and certainly culture, social class? How does that shape, how might that inform what each group or what each, which a student body, a diverse student body would need in order to promote psychological capital? That is it a broad-based frame of reference, everybody's okay, this is how we teach or support PsyCap, or does it need to be influenced in some particular way related to social culture, socioeconomic statuses, or origins, so forth?
I think that's a very good question. I have thought about it a little bit. So, for example, when you're thinking about optimism, so I think, for example, religion can contribute a significant role in people's optimism, spirituality in a more general sense. So different cultures may view PsyCap in a different way. And when I'm saying in a different way, I'm not necessarily like not very drastically, but basically there are some cultural elements that can influence elements of PsyCap. So what I studied was like a nationwide sample, and it was in the United States. So basically, I got different cultures in my sample. I don't know how else I could have done it so that I would have been more aware of the role of cultures, because...
Well, I agree. I'm just asking if you were able to develop, I'm thinking about it, is it a broad-based psychological capital, sort of like...
It is a universal, I would say it is a universal concept. so no matter what your nationality is and what your religion or whatever is, like the concepts are pretty universal. At the same time, there are some cultural elements that can potentially influence elements of PsyCap. So that's why I'm thinking, although it's universal, at the same time, there might be some interplay with other cultural elements and PsyCap elements.
I'd suggest that universal is a bit of a reach, but only because the data aren't there. But it seems as if it might be really beneficial to consider the role of race and ethnicity and social class and culture in developing and endorsing, supporting psychological capital. I'm suggesting it. I haven't done any deep set of studies, but Catholics look at the world a little differently,
Yeah,
than
you're right.
the Baptists that I used to wander around with, in lower Alabama. So I just, not necessarily that there's extraordinary differences, but across social class, our ideas about and feelings about what it means to be empowered and so forth are likely going to look similar and different. Seems like if we're thinking about, if you're considering a next step of application, what would, developing a model of psychological capital intervention or support system, how we would be conscientious about considering that. Just a thought.
Thank you, yeah.
All right, Abbas, that concludes questions. I'm going to ask you and everyone in the room, if we can, to please leave the room so that